The harsh wind carried whispers of death across Ravnholm's frozen shores, as Bjorn Ironside stared at the weathered parchment in his scarred hands. The once mighty warrior had returned to his homeland to claim his father's inheritance, only to discover an aging widow controlled the lands that were rightfully his. What began as a calculated marriage to reclaim his birthright would lead him to discover not only gold hidden beneath the earth, but a truth more valuable than all the treasures of Midgard. The bitter cold of winter's approach stung Bjorn's face as he stood at the bow of the longship. After 8 years abroad, the jagged coastline of Ravnholm finally emerged from the mist, its dark cliffs and ancient pines standing like sentinels against the granite-colored sky. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the dragon-headed prow, eyes fixed on the land that had once been his home. Home, he muttered, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. Nothing awaited him but the ghost of his father's legacy, and the bitter news that had reached him in distant Constantinople. The great Thorgrim Stormcaller's lands now belonged to a widow who had wedded his father in Bjorn's long absence. Behind him the crew worked in reverent silence. These men had followed him across the known world, from the blood-soaked battlefields of Francia to the marble splendor of Eastern empires. Once 40 strong, now barely 15 remained. Their weathered faces told the same story as Bjorn's: glory found, fortunes lost, and the cruel twist of fate that sent them home with little more than the weapons on their backs and the scars that marked their bodies. "She must be withered as winter bark," said Halvard, his oldest friend and shield brother, moving beside him. "This widow who claimed your father in his final years." Bjorn's jaw tightened beneath his frost-streaked beard. 70 winters, the message said. Some healer woman from the northern valleys. A cunning one, to secure Ravnholm's richest lands, through marriage vows. Halvard's one good eye narrowed against the wind, though perhaps not cunning enough to anticipate the return of Thorgrim's only son. Bjorn said nothing. 8 years he had been gone, chasing glory and wealth across distant shores. 8 years since he had stormed from his father's hall after their final thunderous argument, swearing never to return until he had made his own name and fortune. Now he returned with neither. His once legendary warband decimated, their spoils lost in a storm that had nearly claimed Bjorn himself. The bitter irony was not lost on him. He had left to prove himself worthy of inheritance, only to return and find that inheritance slipped through his fingers like sand. As the longship approached the narrow harbour, Bjorn could see Ravnholm village sprawled along the shoreline. Once familiar, now changed. New dwellings clustered where open meadows had been. A stone watchtower rose where once stood a simple wooden lookout. Signs of prosperity that should have been his to oversee. "They'll remember the son of Thorgrim," Halvard offered, reading his thoughts. "The people will rally to you." "Perhaps," Bjorn replied, though doubt clouded his mind like the mist shrouding the hills. "Or perhaps they now answer to the widow who holds my father's seal." The ship slid against the weathered dock with a groan of timbers. No welcoming committee awaited them, only a handful of curious fishermen and children who paused in their work to stare at the warriors disembarking with wary eyes. Bjorn recognized a few faces, now older, harder. They gave brief nods of acknowledgement but maintained their distance. 8 years was a lifetime in these northern lands. Legends faded quickly when their heroes vanished without farewell. Bjorn. "Thorgrimson!" came a voice from the end of the pier. A tall figure approached, grey-bearded and broad-shouldered despite his advanced years. Gunnar Whitehair, his father's steward. The old man's face betrayed no emotion as he studied Bjorn, taking in the changes time had carved into the once young warrior. "You return to Ravnholm with fewer men than you left with," Gunnar observed, his gaze sweeping over the depleted crew. "I return with men who proved their worth," Bjorn replied evenly. "Where others failed." Gunnar nodded slowly. Your father spoke of you near the end, wondered if you would return in time. The words struck Bjorn like a physical blow. I received no word of his illness. Messages were sent. The sea is vast, and you wandered far. Gunnar's eyes held no accusation, merely stated fact. He passed during last winter's darkest moon. Before the spring thaw, he had taken a wife. By midsummer, she held his lands. His lands, Bjorn repeated, the words sharp as flint. My inheritance. The law is clear, Gunnar replied carefully. A widow may claim stewardship until her death, unless the rightful heir contests through proper channels. And what proper channels might those be when I stand here with nothing but my father's name? Bjorn asked, the bitterness of his situation settling over him like a cold fog. That, said Gunnar, is something you must discuss with Lady Sigrid herself. The name hung in the frigid air between them. Sigrid, the woman who now possessed everything that should have been his. Gunnar turned and gestured toward the path that led from the harbour up to the hillside where his father's hall stood. She expects you. Word of your ship reached us yesterday from a trading vessel. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this tale of a Viking's unexpected return speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's episode reveals Bjorn's first encounter with the elderly widow who controls his destiny. Bjorn and his men climbed the winding path that led from the harbour to the great hall that had once been his childhood home. With each step, memories surged unbidden. Running these same paths as a boy, training with his father in the yard beyond, dreaming of the day he would command Ravnholm as its rightful lord. Now he approached as little more than a beggar, his once fine armour patched and worn, his legendary sword widowmaker the only remnant of his former glory. The hall itself had changed. Stone foundations now supported what had once been an all-wooden structure. Intricate carvings adorned the massive doorposts, scenes of the gods and ancient heroes rendered with skill that spoke of considerable wealth spent. A prosperity funded by his father's lands, while Bjorn had struggled to feed his men in distant realms. She's made improvements, Halvard observed carefully, with gold that should have filled my coffers, Bjorn replied, unable to keep the edge from his voice. As they approached, the great doors swung open. A young woman with flame-red hair stood in the entrance, her posture straight as a spear, her eyes appraising Bjorn with unsettling directness. You must be Thorgrim's son, she said, making no move to bow or show deference. I am Freya, Lady Sigrid's granddaughter and voice when she chooses not to speak herself. Bjorn drew himself to his full height, towering over the young woman. I am Bjorn Ironside, rightful heir to Ravnholm and all its territories. I've come to speak with the woman who holds my inheritance. Then wipe the journey from your boots before entering her hall, Freya replied calmly, unintimidated by his stature or tone. And understand that you stand on her threshold, not your own. Halvard's hand moved instinctively to his axe, but Bjorn stayed him with a subtle gesture. This was not a battle to be won with steel. They followed Freya into the great hall, where the memories struck Bjorn with almost physical force. The massive hearth where he had listened to skalds recite the sagas during winter nights, the high seat where his father had dispensed wisdom and judgment, the walls where shields and trophies of their clan had hung for generations. But like the exterior, the inside had transformed. New tapestries depicted unfamiliar scenes, strange artifacts from distant lands adorned shelves and tables. The air carried unfamiliar scents, herbs and incense that reminded Bjorn of markets in far eastern lands. And there, seated in what had once been his father's chair, was a woman who could only be Sigrid. Bjorn had expected a frail crone, bent with age and possibly simple-minded, easy to intimidate or manipulate. The reality shattered his assumptions, like ice beneath a warhammer. Though clearly in her 7th decade, Sigrid sat straight-backed and regal. Silver hair braided intricately with threads of gold framed a face that, while deeply lined, held sharp intelligence in eyes the color of a winter sea. Her hands, resting calmly on carved armrests, were adorned with rings bearing stones Bjorn recognized from his travels: amber from the Baltic, lapis from beyond the Great Desert, jade from lands whose names few Norsemen knew. This was no simple healer who had ensnared an aging chieftain. This was a woman of substance and evident wisdom. "Bjorn Thorgrimsson returns to Ravnholm," she said, her voice surprisingly strong and clear, "with neither the fortune nor the renown he promised his father when he departed these shores." The words struck like precise dagger thrusts. Finding vulnerabilities, Bjorn thought well armored. How much had his father revealed to this woman in their brief union? "I return to claim what is rightfully mine," Bjorn replied, maintaining the stern demeanor that had served him in negotiations with foreign kings and warlords. "My father's lands and holdings." Sigrid's weathered lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of a predictable opening move in a complex game. "Your father's lands," she corrected gently, "passed lawfully to me upon his death, as witnessed by the assembly and recorded by the law speaker. I hold them now as their steward until my own passing." "A convenient arrangement," Bjorn said, unable to keep bitterness from his tone. To wed an aging warrior in his final season and claim his lifetime's work. For the first time, a flash of genuine emotion crossed Sigrid's face. Not anger as he'd expected, but something more complex. Perhaps sorrow, perhaps pity. "Your father and I found each other late in life's journey," she said after a moment, "each with wisdom earned through hardship, each with gifts to offer the other. That you cannot imagine such a union speaks to your youth, not my motives." Bjorn felt wrong-footed, a sensation he despised. He had expected either cowering submission or fiery defiance. Either would have given him clear direction. This calm, measured response left him uncertain of his next move. "Regardless of your arrangement with my father," he pressed on, "the law also states that a direct blood heir takes precedence over a marriage claim, particularly one of such brief duration." "Indeed," Sigrid nodded, unperturbed. "If that heir can demonstrate his capacity to manage such holdings responsibly. Your father expressed significant doubts on that matter, I'm afraid." The hall seemed to grow colder as her words hung in the air. Around them, servants and household members had paused in their tasks, watching the confrontation with barely concealed interest. "My father is dead," Bjorn stated flatly. "His doubts died with him. But his judgment lives on through those who knew his mind," Sigrid countered smoothly. "The Council of Elders who confirmed my stewardship did so with full knowledge of your existence, Bjorn Ironside. They weighed the claim of an absent son against the stability of Ravnholm and found the latter more compelling." Bjorn felt the ground shifting beneath him like a battlefield giving way to mud. He had expected to fight for his birthright, yes, but against a solitary widow easily overwhelmed by legal maneuvering or, if necessary, implied threats. Instead, he faced not just Sigrid, but apparently the backing of the regional assembly. A far more formidable obstacle. "You speak of stability," he said, gathering himself, "yet I see before me a woman whose remaining years must surely be few. What becomes of Ravnholm when winter claims you, as it eventually must?" Rather than taking offense, Sigrid laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even her granddaughter. "Direct as your father, though lacking his tact," she observed. "Yes, death approaches me as it does all living things. The question of succession beyond my stewardship remains open, as your father intended it to be." "Meaning?" Bjorn demanded. "Meaning that Thorgrim wished his lands to be governed by one who understood their true value," Sigrid replied. not merely their worth in silver and trade goods, but their deeper significance to this region and its people. Halvard shifted uncomfortably beside Bjorn. This conversation was veering into territory neither of them had anticipated. "You speak in riddles, old woman," Bjorn said, patience fraying. "These lands have been in my bloodline for 5 generations. No temporary marriage can supersede that claim." "No," Sigrid agreed, surprising him. "Blood has meaning, tradition has power, but your father believed that understanding has greater value than either, hence his final decree." She gestured to Freya, who approached with a sealed parchment bearing Thorgrim's distinctive mark pressed into wax. "Your father's will," Sigrid explained, "authorized by the law speaker and witnessed by the council. Within it, he establishes a path for you to reclaim your inheritance, should you prove worthy of it." Bjorn took the parchment, breaking the seal with controlled movements that belied the storm raging within. His eyes scanned the Norse runes, written in the precise hand of a trained scribe. The contents struck him like a physical blow. According to his father's final wishes, Bjorn could indeed reclaim Ravnholm and all its territories, but only by pledging himself in marriage to Sigrid for a period of no less than 1 full year, serving as her husband and steward, learning the management of the holdings under her guidance. Should he fulfill this obligation honorably, upon her death or by her declaration of his readiness, whichever came first, full ownership would transfer to him without condition or question. Bjorn looked up from the parchment, meeting Sigrid's steady gaze with disbelief. "This is madness," he said hoarsely. "You expect me to wed a woman older than my grandmother? To play husband, to secure what is already mine by right of birth?" "I expect nothing," Sigrid replied calmly. "The choice is entirely yours. Accept your father's terms and remain in Ravnholm as my husband and student, or depart these shores again to seek your fortune elsewhere. The lands will remain under my stewardship until my death, at which point they would pass to Freya, whom I have named as my heir in the absence of a more suitable candidate." The implication was clear. Reject the offer, and Bjorn's inheritance would pass permanently outside his bloodline. His father's final jest, or final lesson, had placed him in an impossible position. Halvard leaned close, speaking low for Bjorn's ears alone. "A year passes quickly, my friend, and 70 winters is a venerable age. Nature may resolve this challenge sooner than the parchment requires." The cold calculation in his friend's words mirrored Bjorn's own thoughts, a fact that disturbed him more than he cared to admit. Had he become the type of man who would wish death upon an elderly woman to hasten his inheritance? "I require time to consider this proposal," Bjorn said finally, carefully controlling his voice. "Of course," Sigrid nodded. "You and your men may remain in the guest quarters for 3 days. By then, I will expect your answer." She rose with surprising grace for one of her years. "In the meantime, you will find food and drink prepared. Rest, recover from your journey. Ravnholm welcomes back her prodigal son, whatever his decision may be." With that, she departed the hall, Freya close at her side, leaving Bjorn standing before his father's empty chair, holding a parchment that offered him everything he desired, at a price he never imagined paying. That night, as Bjorn lay sleepless, in the guest quarters of what should have been his own hall, his mind raced through possibilities like a ship navigating treacherous waters. The choices before him seemed equally unpalatable. Abandon his birthright forever, or bind himself to an ancient widow in a marriage that would make him the laughingstock of the Norse lands. Yet, beneath his indignation, another emotion stirred. Curiosity. What game was this shrewd old woman playing? What had she offered his father in his final days that had prompted such an unusual arrangement? And most puzzling of all, what was the true value of Ravnholm that she claimed he needed? To understand? As dawn approached, Bjorn made his decision. He would accept this humiliating arrangement temporarily. A year would pass quickly enough. He would learn what secrets this widow kept, secure his inheritance, and restore his reputation. After all, he had survived 8 years of warfare, treachery, and hardship across the known world. Surely he could endure 1 year as husband to an aging widow. With the first light breaking across the fjord, Bjorn rose and prepared to announce his acceptance of his father's terms, unaware that his decision would lead him not only to the secret wealth hidden beneath Ravnholm's ancient soil, but to a discovery that would change his understanding of everything he had once held true. Dawn broke over Ravnholm with a pale, hesitant light. Bjorn stood at the window of his guest quarters, watching as the settlement below stirred to life. Fishermen dragged their boats to the shore, women kindled cooking fires, children ran errands between dwellings, a rhythm of community life that had continued uninterrupted by his absence. His father's death. The arrival of Sigrid. 3 days. That was the time he had been given to accept or reject the most humiliating proposal any warrior could face. Wed an elderly woman for the privilege of reclaiming what was rightfully his by birth. A soft knock on the door broke his reverie. Elvard entered without waiting for permission. A habit formed through decades of brotherhood in arms. "You've decided," he stated rather than asked, reading Bjorn's posture as easily as written runes. "I have no choice," Bjorn replied, turning from the window. "If I reject this arrangement, my father's lands pass to that red-haired granddaughter. Our bloodline's holdings gone forever." Halvard nodded, his weathered face impassive, a temporary humiliation to secure a permanent legacy. 1 year, Bjorn said, more to convince himself than his friend. "I endured 8 years of war, starvation, and treachery across the Eastern world. I can endure 12 months as a husband in name only to a woman whose remaining days must be few." "And if the widow has conditions beyond those stated in the parchment?" Halvard asked carefully. "Marriage often comes with expectations." Bjorn grimaced at the implication. "Then I will fulfill them as a warrior faces any unpleasant duty, though I suspect Lady Sigrid seeks a steward more than a bedmate." "And what of us?" Halvard gestured vaguely toward the harbour, where the remainder of their once mighty warband waited. 15 men who followed you across the known world, only to end their journey in a village where they have no place. It was a question Bjorn had wrestled with through his sleepless night. These men had sacrificed everything for him, believed in his promise of glory and wealth. Now he would ask them to wait while he played husband to an elderly widow. "They will be provided for," Bjorn said with more confidence than he felt. "If these lands are as prosperous as they appear, there will be positions worthy of warriors, guardsmen, trainers of younger fighters, perhaps even raiders come spring, if the widow can be convinced." Halvard nodded, though doubt shadowed his remaining eye. "I will inform them of your decision. Most will stay out of loyalty, though some may seek other jarls to follow." "Let them choose freely," Bjorn replied. "I've led them to neither the glory nor wealth I promised. I hold no man to oaths made in different circumstances." When Halvard had gone, Bjorn dressed with deliberate care. From his meager belongings, he selected the least damaged of his garments, a tunic of Byzantine silk acquired during their campaigns in the East, a belt with silver fittings, and the arm rings that marked his status as a commander of men. His appearance must convey that he came to this arrangement as an equal, not a supplicant. The great hall was bustling with morning activity when Bjorn entered. Servants moved efficiently between tables, clearing remnants of the household's breakfast. A pair of local merchants waited near the entrance, clearly seeking audience with the hall's mistress. In his father's time, they would have been approaching Bjorn for such matters. Sigrid sat in the high seat, engaged in conversation with a heavy-set man Bjorn recognized as Torvald Brodax, head of the village council. They spoke in low tones, heads inclined toward each other with the familiar ease of regular associates. Freya noticed Bjorn first, her keen eyes tracking his movement across the threshold. With a subtle gesture to her grandmother, she interrupted the conversation, directing Sigrid's attention to the waiting heir, Bjorn Thorgrimsson. Sigrid acknowledged, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. "You've reached a decision regarding your father's terms." The activity in the hall quieted, as servants and visitors alike paused to witness the exchange. Word had clearly spread of the ultimatum presented to Thorgrim's wayward son. Bjorn approached the high seat with measured steps, aware of every eye upon him. Pride demanded he appear neither eager nor reluctant, but rather accepting of an inevitable arrangement. "I have," he replied, stopping at a respectful distance. "I accept the terms as set forth in my father's will. I will wed you as stipulated and serve as steward to these lands for the prescribed period." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Whatever they had expected, perhaps a thunderous rejection, perhaps further negotiation, this simple acceptance seemed to surprise them. Sigrid's expression revealed nothing beyond polite acknowledgement. "Your decision honors your father's wishes," she said evenly. "The ceremony shall take place at tomorrow's sunset, witnessed by the village council and recorded by the law speaker. Until then, you remain our honored guest." No joy, no triumph, no relief. Her reaction struck Bjorn as peculiar. Most widows would express some satisfaction at securing a husband several decades their junior, particularly one with Bjorn's lineage and reputation. Yet Sigrid received his acceptance as casually as she might acknowledge a report on grain stores. "There is the matter of my men," Bjorn said, pressing forward while the formal exchange continued. 15 warriors who have served me faithfully across many campaigns. They require suitable accommodations and roles befitting their status." For the first time, genuine interest flickered across Sigrid's features. Experienced fighters are always valuable. Ravnholm's guard could benefit from new blood and foreign techniques. "Freya, see that arrangements are made for appropriate quarters in the western barracks." The red-haired young woman nodded, though her eyes narrowed slightly at Bjorn. Unlike her grandmother, Freya made no attempt to hide her suspicion of his motives. "Is there anything else you require before tomorrow's ceremony?" Sigrid asked, her tone suggesting the audience was nearing its conclusion. Bjorn hesitated. A question had been forming since his first glimpse of the transformed Ravnholm village, one that professional pride demanded he ask, despite its potential to further undermine his position. The improvements to the settlement, stone foundations where once stood wood, a new watchtower, expanded docks. These changes came after my father's death? Sigrid studied him for a moment before answering. Some were initiated during Thorgrim's final year. Others were my own undertaking after his passing. Ravnholm prospers, as you can see. Through what means? Bjorn pressed. These lands were wealthy under my father's stewardship, but not to the degree such rapid improvements would suggest. A smile touched Sigrid's lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps this is the first lesson in your stewardship, Bjorn Ironside. Wealth flows from understanding what lies beneath the surface, of lands, of opportunities, and of people. Before we continue with Sigrid's cryptic answer, if you're enjoying this Viking tale, make sure to hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Tomorrow's video will reveal what happens at the unusual wedding ceremony. "Do speak in riddles," Bjorn said, echoing his complaint from their first meeting. "I speak of wisdom your father valued," Sigrid countered smoothly. "The same wisdom he hoped you might acquire through this arrangement." The conversation was clearly over. With a nod that communicated respect without submission, Bjorn withdrew from the hall, mind churning with questions and suspicions. Something beyond mere land stewardship was at play in Ravnholm. His father, never a man for elaborate schemes, had constructed a complex arrangement that served some purpose Bjorn couldn't yet fathom. Outside, the winter air bit at his face, a sharp contrast to the heated atmosphere of the hall. Halvard waited. In the practice yard, where once Bjorn and his father had trained daily with sword and shield. "It's done," his friend asked as Bjorn approached. "Tomorrow at sunset," Bjorn confirmed, his voice low. "But there's more happening here than a simple matter of inheritance. The old woman speaks of wealth flowing from what lies beneath the surface, yet is deliberately vague about the source of Ravnholm's newfound prosperity." Halvard grunted thoughtfully. "Secret trade arrangements, perhaps. Your father had connections with merchants as far south as the Arabic lands." "Perhaps," Bjorn conceded, though unconvinced. "Or something found on the land itself. The old stories speak of ancient burials in these hills, with treasure hoards accompanying the dead. Grave goods?" Halvard's eye widened slightly. "Dangerous business, disturbing the honored dead. Not like your father to risk angering the ancestors." "No," Bjorn agreed, which makes this all the more puzzling. They were interrupted by approaching footsteps. Freya walked toward them, her red hair bright against the winter landscape, a fur-lined cloak wrapped tightly around her slender frame. "My grandmother requests that you join her council meeting this afternoon," she informed Bjorn without preamble. "As future steward, you should begin familiarizing yourself with Ravnholm's affairs immediately." "I would be honored," Bjorn replied carefully, studying the young woman's face. If anyone knew Sigrid's secrets, it would be this granddaughter who served as her right hand. Freya met his gaze without wavering. "The meeting concerns the northern boundary markers and preparations for spring planting. Nothing that would interest a warrior accustomed to more violent pursuits." The slight was deliberate, testing his reaction. Bjorn refused to rise to the bait. "On the contrary, I find the management of lands and people requires similar strategic thinking to warfare. Both demand understanding terrain, resources, and human nature." Something like surprise flickered across Freya's features before her expression returned to careful neutrality. "We shall see the great hall 1 hour past midday." With that, she turned and walked away, her steps quick and purposeful. "The granddaughter dislikes you," Halvard observed unnecessarily. "She sees me as a threat to her inheritance," Bjorn replied. "Were our positions reversed, I might view her with similar suspicion." As the council meeting hour approached, Bjorn toured the settlement, reacquainting himself with the village he'd once called home. Everywhere he looked, evidence of prosperity greeted him. New fishing vessels in the harbour, expanded smithies, additional grain storage. Not just cosmetic improvements, but substantive investments in Ravnholm's future. Most telling were the people themselves. Unlike many Norse settlements that struggled through winter months with thin faces and cautious rationing, Ravnholm's inhabitants appeared well-fed and adequately clothed against the cold. Children played in the streets rather than working constantly, alongside adults, suggesting plentiful hands for necessary labor. All this had been achieved in just 2 years since his father's marriage to Sigrid. The timeline strained credibility, unless some new source of wealth had been discovered. The council meeting proved equally enlightening, though not in ways Bjorn had anticipated. Seated at the far end of the table from Sigrid, he observed as village elders and craftmasters discussed matters ranging from boundary disputes to trade agreements with neighboring settlements. Throughout, Sigrid demonstrated a surprising command of details: crop rotations, lumber harvesting rates, fishing ground allocations, far beyond what one would expect from a healer woman recently arrived from the northern valleys. Most revealing was the deference shown to her judgment. These were proud Norse leaders, men and women accustomed to voicing strong opinions, yet they consistently deferred to Sigrid's quiet authority. Not from fear, Bjorn noted, but from genuine respect. "The question of the new dock expansion remains," announced Torvald Broadaxe as the meeting neared its conclusion. "The additional materials required will strain our timber supplies unless we open new cutting areas in the eastern forest, which risks conflict with Hrafnkel's people," added a grey-haired woman Bjorn recognized as Astrid Shipwright. "Their boundary claims have always been aggressive." All eyes turned to Sigrid, including Bjorn's. Her response would reveal much about her strategic thinking. "The timber from the eastern forest is unnecessary," she said calmly. "We'll source what we need from the northern slopes. The journey is longer, but the wood is better suited to our purposes." Murmurs of disagreement rippled through the council. "The northern slopes are sacred ground," objected an elderly man wearing a hammer pendant. "Our ancestors forbade cutting there since before my grandfather's time." "Not all the northern territory," Sigrid corrected gently. "Only the burial grounds themselves. The western-facing slopes remain available and untouched for generations. The trees there have grown tall and straight, perfect for dock timbers." Bjorn watched the exchange with growing fascination. Sacred ground, ancestral prohibitions. These were matters a newcomer to Ravnholm would typically approach with caution, yet Sigrid discussed them with the familiarity of one born to these lands. As the council members debated the logistics of harvesting from the northern slopes, Bjorn leaned toward a leather-aproned man seated beside him. "The burial grounds she mentioned," he asked quietly. "These are the ancient barrows from the sagas." The man, a metalworker judging by his calloused hands, nodded solemnly. 12 mounds where the first settlers of Ravnholm were laid to rest. Wealthy chieftains and their families, if the stories are true. No one ventures there willingly, especially as winter approaches. The dead walk on such grounds when the nights grow long. Superstition, Bjorn thought, though he kept his skepticism hidden. Yet something about these burial grounds nagged at his memory. Stories his father had told around the hearth fire, tales of ancestors and hidden treasures, and warnings about disturbing ancient resting places. His attention snapped back to the council as Sigrid brought the meeting to a close. "Tomorrow's wedding will be followed by the traditional feast," she announced, "as is proper for the joining of two houses. Bjorn Ironside will thereafter assume his duties as my husband and steward in training for Ravnholm." The formal phrasing left no doubt about the nature of their arrangement. This was a marriage of political necessity, not personal affection. Yet, as the council members filed out of the hall, Bjorn caught Sigrid watching him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. Assessment, certainly, but perhaps also something like anticipation. That evening, as wedding preparations bustled around him, Bjorn found himself drawn to his father's private chambers, now occupied by Sigrid, though he had been granted permission to retrieve personal items left behind 8 years earlier. The room had changed little, surprisingly. His father's weapons still adorned the walls, his carved chest still stood at the foot of the bed. Only the addition of Sigrid's herbs hanging from the rafters and her weaving loom in the corner marked the change in occupancy. As Bjorn searched for the small carved box containing his mother's arm rings, wedding gifts he had promised to reclaim someday, his eye caught a detail that sent a chill through his battle-hardened frame. Partially hidden behind the loom stood a staff of ash wood, its surface carved with runes that seemed to shift in the flickering light. At its top, bound with silver wire, sat a stone of deep blue that Bjorn recognized from distant trading markets. Lapis lazuli, more precious than gold in some lands. Not just any staff, a Seder staff used by those women who practiced the deep magic, vulvas whose powers were both respected and feared throughout the Norse lands. Sigrid was no simple healer. She was a vulva, a seeress, whose magic could shape fates and reveal hidden truths. Suddenly his father's unusual marriage and the cryptic terms of his will took on new, unsettling dimensions. What had this woman shown Thorgrim in his final days? What secrets had she revealed that would convince a proud warrior to create such an elaborate scheme for his son's inheritance? And most importantly, what lay beneath Ravnholm's surface that required a Volva's power to discover? The answers, Bjorn suspected, would begin to reveal themselves tomorrow, when he bound himself in marriage to a woman whose magic might prove more formidable than any blade he had faced in his years of warfare. Wedding preparations dominated Ravnholm as the sun climbed toward its zenith. Servants scurried between buildings carrying furs, mead barrels, and freshly slaughtered livestock. Though winter weddings were uncommon among the Norse, the village embraced the celebration with unexpected enthusiasm. Bjorn observed the activity. From the stone steps of the great hall, a heavy fur cloak wrapped around his broad shoulders. The discovery of Sigrid's cedar staff had kept him awake through most of the night, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. A Volva for a bride, not just an aging widow, but a woman of power who communed with forces beyond ordinary. Understanding. "You appear troubled for a man about to secure his inheritance," came Halvard's voice as his friend joined him on the steps. "Second thoughts?" "Information changes strategy," Bjorn replied quietly. "The widow is a Volva." Halvard's single eye widened, his body tensing instinctively. Like most warriors, he held a complex mixture of respect and wariness toward practitioners. "Of the deep magic. You're certain?" "I found her cedar staff," Bjorn confirmed, "not displayed openly, but not carefully hidden either, as if she expected it to be discovered." "The magic explains much," Halvard mused after a moment's consideration. "Her influence over the council, your father's unexpected marriage, perhaps even Ravnholm's prosperity. Or perhaps she simply bewitched an aging man to secure wealth for herself," Bjorn replied, voicing the darker suspicion that had plagued his thoughts. Halvard shook his head slowly. "Your father was many things, but never easily led. Even Odin himself would have struggled to bend Thorgrim Stormcaller against his will." Before Bjorn could respond, the great hall doors opened behind them. Freya emerged, her red hair now intricately braided with silver threads and small amber beads. She wore a ceremonial apron dress of deep blue wool, its edges embroidered with protective runes, the attire of a woman representing her family at a significant ritual. "My grandmother requests your presence," she informed Bjorn, her tone more formal than their previous exchanges. "There are matters to discuss before the ceremony." Bjorn exchanged a glance with Halvard before nodding. "Lead the way." Rather than returning to the great hall, Freya guided him along a side path that wound behind the main buildings toward a smaller structure Bjorn remembered as his father's private contemplation house. Built partly into the hillside and roofed with living turf, it had always been a place where Thorgrim retreated when important decisions required consideration away from the bustle of village life. "I didn't expect your grandmother to use my father's thinking house," Bjorn observed as they approached. "It serves her purposes," Freya replied cryptically. "Some conversations require privacy beyond what walls alone can provide." The interior of the small building remained much as Bjorn remembered. A central hearth, bench seats along the walls, and a smoke hole in the roof that allowed a narrow beam of daylight to penetrate the dimness. Yet notable additions marked Sigrid's influence. Bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, strange symbols carved into the support posts, and a stone basin filled with water positioned precisely where the light from above would strike. At certain hours, Sigrid herself sat beside the hearth, but not in the posture of an elderly woman awaiting her bridegroom. Instead, she knelt on a spread of wolf pelts, her silver hair unbound and flowing over shoulders that suddenly seemed straighter and stronger than Bjorn had previously observed. Her eyes, when they met his, held clarity and purpose that belied her 70 winters. "Leave us," she instructed Freya, who hesitated only briefly before departing, closing the heavy wooden door behind her. "You found my staff," Sigrid stated once they were alone. Not a question, but a confirmation of something. Expected. Bjorn saw no point in denial. "I did. And now you wonder if I bewitched your father. If this marriage is some elaborate scheme to claim Ravnholm's wealth through Seder rather than honest means." The directness of her assessment made prevarication impossible. The thought occurred. Sigrid nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "You left these shores as a warrior seeking glory. You return as a man who has learned suspicion and calculation, not unreasonable given your journey." She gestured to the bench opposite her. "Sit before. You bind yourself to me before gods and community. You deserve truth, or as much of it as you can comprehend without witnessing for yourself." Bjorn settled on the bench, maintaining the alertness that had kept him alive through countless uncertain encounters. "Speak then. What magic bound my father to you?" "No magic," Sigrid replied, her weathered hands resting calmly on her knees. "Only knowledge. Your father sought me out, not the reverse." This revelation contradicted everything Bjorn had assumed. Why would Thorgrim Stormcaller seek a Volva from the northern valleys? Because he discovered something beneath Ravnholm's soil that defied his understanding. Something that frightened even a man who had faced death in 100 battles. The intensity in her voice caught Bjorn off guard. Whatever he had expected, confessions of manipulation perhaps, or mystical riddles, this blunt declaration, wasn't it? 3 winters ago," Sigrid continued, "while expanding the root cellars beneath the western storehouse, your father's workers broke through into an older structure. Not a natural cave, but a chamber built with stones, fitted so precisely no mortar was needed between them. The work of hands, but not Norse hands." Bjorn leaned forward despite himself. "What hands, then?" "The ancient ones. Those who dwelled in these lands before our ancestors sailed from the eastern shores. Those whose knowledge has been lost to all but a few who preserve the old ways." Despite his skepticism toward mystical claims, Bjorn felt a prickle along his spine. The ancient ones featured in fireside tales. Beings of great power who shaped the land itself before retreating into myth as humans claimed their territories. And what did they leave behind that concerned my father so greatly? Sigrid's eyes reflected the small fire between them. A doorway, sealed with symbols no one in Ravnholm could decipher. Your father recognized enough to understand its importance and its potential danger if opened incorrectly. So he sought you, Bjorn concluded, for your knowledge of ancient symbols. For my connection to the old wisdom, yes. I'm among the last who maintain certain understandings that have faded from common knowledge. Thorgrim sent messengers to 3 Volvas known for their depth of sight. I was the only one who answered. Bjorn processed this information against what he knew of his father. A practical man, suspicious of magic, yet respectful of powers beyond human control. If Thorgrim had sought a Volva's assistance, something truly significant must have been discovered. And this doorway, you opened it? Eventually, Sigrid acknowledged, after proper preparations and protections were established. What we found beyond would change Ravnholm's fortunes forever, if managed with wisdom rather than greed. Before we continue this revelation, if you're enjoying this Viking saga, take a moment to subscribe and share where you're watching from. Tomorrow's episode will reveal what lies beyond the ancient doorway. Gold, Bjorn guessed, remembering the title hints about hidden wealth. A treasure hoard from these ancients. Sigrid's lips curved slightly. Gold, yes, but not merely metal. To be melted into arm rings or trading weights. Something far more precious, knowledge crystallized into physical form. The ancient ones discovered how to extract gold from stone that shows no visible trace of it. They left behind both samples of their work and instructions for those wise enough to follow their methods. The implications struck Bjorn immediately. Most gold came from river panning or visible veins in rock, laborious work with unpredictable results. A method to extract the precious metal from ordinary-seeming stone would be worth more than any single treasure hoard. "This is the source of Ravnholm's new prosperity," he said, understanding dawning. "Not grave goods or raiding, but a secret method of gold extraction. A method that requires specific knowledge to implement safely," Sigrid emphasized. "The process involves substances that can kill if mishandled. It requires patience and precision rather than brute force. Your father recognized its value and the danger it would pose in the wrong hands." "Such as mine?" Bjorn asked, a new bitterness entering his voice. "Is that why he placed these conditions on my inheritance? He thought me too reckless to trust with such knowledge?" Sigrid studied him for a long moment before answering. "He thought you unready when you departed these shores. Whether you have grown into a man who can wield great wealth responsibly, that was the question he wished answered before placing such power in your hands." "By binding me to an aging vulva," Bjorn said flatly. "By binding you to someone who understands the responsibility that comes with knowledge," Sigrid corrected. "Someone who could assess whether you sought only personal glory or the betterment of your people." She rose to her feet with surprising agility for her age. "Now you know what lies beneath this marriage arrangement. The choice remains yours. Wed me, learn the secrets beneath Ravnholm's soil, and prove yourself worthy of your father's legacy, or depart with your pride intact but your birthright forfeited." Bjorn remained seated, mind racing through implications. The discovery explained everything: Ravnholm's prosperity, his father's unusual marriage, the elaborate conditions of inheritance. A method to extract gold from ordinary stone would make this small coastal village wealthier than many kingdoms. "If I agree," he said carefully, "what exactly would this arrangement entail? You speak of assessment and learning, but the terms remain vague. You would learn the extraction method gradually as you demonstrate readiness. You would participate in council decisions concerning Ravnholm's development. You would help protect our secret from those who would exploit it without understanding its proper management." Sigrid's expression remained unreadable. "And yes, you would be my husband in name, with separate sleeping quarters, but the public appearance of a proper union. And after a year, if I judge you ready, full knowledge and authority will pass to you, regardless of whether I live or die. If not," she shrugged slightly, "your father's will allows for extensions of the arrangement until readiness is demonstrated." The terms were both better and worse than Bjorn had imagined. Freedom from physical obligations to an elderly bride, but potentially indefinite subjugation to her judgment of his readiness. A subjective measure he could not control. "And if I refuse, then Ravnholm's secret remains protected by other means," Sigrid replied simply. "Freya has already begun the necessary training. She lacks your blood right, but possesses patience you have yet to demonstrate." Bjorn stood, bringing himself to his full height. "You offer knowledge and wealth beyond. Measure yet place yourself as gatekeeper. How do I know this isn't simply another form of manipulation? That once wed, you won't find me perpetually unready to claim my inheritance?" "You don't," Sigrid acknowledged with unexpected frankness. "Just as I don't know whether you've returned as a man worthy of what your father built, or merely as a fortune hunter who would exploit Ravnholm's resources until nothing remains. Trust must begin somewhere." Her honesty, at least, seemed genuine, and the prospect of unlimited gold, not stolen or traded, but created through secret knowledge, represented power beyond anything Bjorn had sought in his years of warfare. "I will honor our arrangement," he decided finally. "But know this, I am not a man easily controlled or manipulated. I will learn what you have to teach, but I expect fair judgment of my progress." Sigrid inclined her head slightly. "I would expect nothing less from Thorgrim's son. She moved toward the door, then paused. "The ceremony begins at sunset. Wear the arm rings you sought last night. They belonged to your mother, but were crafted by the ancient method we now control. Your father wanted you to have them for this occasion." With that, she departed, leaving Bjorn alone in the thinking house, with thoughts far more complex than when he'd entered. Gold from stone, ancient knowledge, a father who had planned more carefully for his son's return than Bjorn could have imagined. The wedding ceremony itself was conducted with all the traditional elements one would expect of a union between prominent Norse families. Despite winter's approach, the weather held fair enough for the ritual to take place in the open air before the great hall, with the entire settlement gathered to witness. Bjorn stood beside the ceremonial fire, dressed in the finest garments. He possessed, still battle-worn, but arranged with dignity. His mother's arm rings, burnished to a warm glow, encircled his wrists. Across from him stood Sigrid, her silver hair bound up in a complex arrangement befitting a bride, though her age made the traditional bridal crown seem unnecessary. The village law speaker presided, his voice carrying clearly as he recited the ancient formulas binding two people, two families, two fates together. Representatives from both sides exchanged swords, Halvard standing for Bjorn's family, Freya for Sigrid's. The bride and groom both drank from a ceremonial horn, sealing their commitment with mead, blessed for fertility and prosperity. Throughout, Bjorn maintained the stoic dignity expected of a warrior groom, though inwardly he marveled at the strange turn his life had taken. He had left Ravnholm seeking glory through battle. He returned to find it through an old woman's wisdom and secrets buried in the earth. As the final words were spoken and the assembled villagers erupted in cheers and calls for the feast to begin, Bjorn caught Sigrid watching him with an expression that seemed to contain both assessment and something like hope. The look vanished quickly as they were surrounded by well-wishers and guided toward the great hall where tables groaned beneath platters of winter's bounty. The feast proceeded as tradition demanded: abundant food, flowing mead, boisterous toasts celebrating the union. Bjorn's warriors, initially awkward in this unexpected scenario, soon warmed to the celebration as Ravnholm's mead loosened their reserve. Even Halvard was seen laughing with a group of local shipwrights, his usual wariness temporarily set aside. Only Freya maintained her distance, observing the proceedings with cool detachment from a corner of the hall. When their eyes met across the crowded space, Bjorn saw calculation in her gaze, and perhaps resentment. The granddaughter who had expected to inherit both Sigrid's knowledge and Ravnholm's wealth now faced displacement by a returning son who had abandoned his birthright. Years ago, an adversary to watch, Bjorn noted, though not one to underestimate. Her position as Sigrid's blood relative and apparent apprentice gave her influence he would need to navigate carefully. As the night deepened and the celebration showed no signs of abating, Sigrid appeared at Bjorn's side. Despite hours of feasting and ritual, she showed no signs of the fatigue one might expect from a woman of her years. "It is time," she said quietly, audible only to him above the din of celebration. "There is something you must see tonight, while the moon stands full above Ravnholm." Bjorn nodded, rising from his seat at the high table. Together, they made the traditional departure of a newly wedded couple, accepting ribald jests and good wishes with appropriate grace. But rather than proceeding to the private chambers prepared for them, Sigrid led him out the rear entrance of the great hall and along a path that wound toward the western storehouse, the location where, according to her earlier revelation, his father's workers had first broken through into the ancient chamber. "No attendants?" Bjorn asked, noting they walked alone despite the usual custom of escorting a wedding couple to their bedchamber. "What I show you tonight requires privacy," Sigrid replied. "Freya knows to manage any who might wonder at our absence." The western storehouse stood dark and quiet, its normal activity suspended for the wedding feast. Sigrid produced a small, iron key from within her ceremonial garments, unlocking a heavy door set into the ground beside the main structure. Stone steps descended into darkness, illuminated only by the small oil lamp she had retrieved from a niche beside the entrance. These steps were built after the discovery, she explained as they descended. Your father insisted on controlling access to what lies below. The stairway ended in a small antechamber carved from the living rock. 3 sealed barrels stood against one wall, marked with warning runes Bjorn recognized from his travels, symbols used throughout the Norse lands to indicate dangerous contents. A heavy wooden door, inlaid with bronze bands, blocked the far wall, secured with both a physical lock and what appeared to be magical sigils etched into its surface. Sigrid approached this barrier, placing her palm against a central symbol that seemed to shimmer slightly in the lamplight. She spoke words in a language Bjorn didn't recognize, neither Norse nor any Eastern tongue he had encountered. The sigils flared briefly with blue light before fading, and the lock mechanism clicked open without her touching it. The first. Protection, she said, pushing the door open to reveal a tunnel beyond. Only those with knowledge of the proper words may pass, without triggering safeguards your father and I established. The passageway extended perhaps 30 paces before opening into the chamber Sigrid had described earlier. Here, Bjorn saw immediately the difference between Norse craftsmanship and something far older. The walls were formed of massive stone blocks fitted together with impossible precision, their surfaces covered with spiral patterns and symbols unlike any runic writing he had seen in his travels. At the center of the chamber stood what could only be described as the doorway Sigrid had mentioned, a perfect arch cut from a single slab of dark stone, its surface inscribed with the same unknown symbols. The space within the arch was not open, however, but sealed with what appeared to be a door of solid metal, its surface gleaming despite the apparent age of the structure. Gold? Bjorn asked, approaching cautiously. Not merely gold, Sigrid corrected. Something the ancient ones created through their methods. Gold refined and combined with other substances to create material that neither tarnishes nor weakens with time. She gestured toward a workbench along one wall, where various implements were arranged in careful order: crucibles, tongs, measuring devices, and containers of powders and liquids. Here is where we implement the knowledge recovered from beyond the doorway, she explained. A small operation, carefully managed to prevent notice by outsiders who might not understand the responsibility such knowledge entails. Bjorn examined the equipment with growing fascination. And what lies beyond the golden door? That, Sigrid said, with the first genuine smile he had seen from her, is what you shall begin to learn tomorrow as my husband and student. Tonight was merely to show you the truth of my words and the magnitude of what your father entrusted to my care until you proved ready to receive it. She extended her hand, a formal gesture sealing their arrangement. Welcome to your true inheritance, Bjorn Ironside, far more valuable than land or titles, knowledge that could reshape the fortunes of the Norse people if wielded with wisdom, rather than greed. Bjorn took her offered hand, feeling calluses that spoke of work beyond what one might expect from an elderly healer or volva. This woman had clearly spent countless hours in this underground chamber, mastering secrets from a civilization long vanished from the northern lands. I will learn, he promised, the words feeling more significant than his wedding vows spoken hours earlier. And I will prove worthy of this inheritance. Whether he spoke truth or merely what was necessary to gain control of unimaginable wealth, Bjorn himself could not have said with certainty. But as he stood before the golden doorway with his unlikely bride, he felt something he had not experienced in his years of warfare and wandering. A sense of purpose beyond mere survival or glory. Whatever secrets waited beyond that gleaming barrier, They represented something his father had deemed worth protecting through an elaborate scheme spanning beyond his own death. For the first time since receiving news of Thorgrim's passing, Bjorn felt a connection to the father he had parted from in anger 8 years before. Perhaps, he thought, as they sealed the chamber and returned to the world above, there was wisdom in this arrangement beyond what either he or Sigrid fully understood. Perhaps the true gold to be found beneath Ravnholm's soil was not the metal itself, but the understanding it would forge between a father's legacy and a son's future. Days turned to weeks as winter tightened its grip on Ravnholm. Snow blanketed the settlement, transforming the rugged landscape into a pristine white canvas, broken only by the dark shapes of buildings and the winding paths kept clear by daily foot traffic. The fjord froze along its edges, limiting fishing to the deeper waters, accessible only on days when the weather permitted launching the larger vessels. For Bjorn, this period marked a transformation far more profound than the changing season. Each morning he rose before dawn and joined Sigrid in the chamber beneath the western storehouse, where she began his instruction in the ancient art of gold extraction. The process proved more complex than he had imagined, involving not just physical techniques, but an understanding of elements that bordered on what most Norsemen would consider magic. These substances must be combined with exact precision, Sigrid explained on their third day of training, indicating measurements of powders in small stone cups. Too much of the yellow powder creates fumes that can kill if inhaled. Too little, and the separation fails entirely. Bjorn watched attentively as her weathered hands demonstrated the mixture, noting how her movements combined the deliberate precision of a skilled craftsman with the reverence of a priestess performing sacred rites. This was knowledge passed down through generations of vulvas, preserved while kingdoms rose and fell around them. "And this is how the Ancient Ones created their wealth?" he asked, studying the crucible where the prepared mixture now heated over. "Carefully controlled flames. One of their methods," Sigrid corrected. "Their understanding of the world's hidden properties extended far beyond what I'm showing you now. This is merely what your father and I managed to decipher from their instructions." The mention of Thorgrim still provoked a complicated surge of emotions in Bjorn. Anger at being excluded from his father's discovery, respect for the foresight shown in protecting it, and a growing sense that perhaps his father had understood him better than he'd realized. Why did he never send word to me about this discovery? The question had gnawed at Bjorn throughout his first weeks back in Ravnholm. Surely such knowledge would have brought me home sooner. Sigrid added a careful measure of clear liquid to the crucible before responding. He considered it, but he feared what might happen if knowledge of Ravnholm's newfound wealth spread widely too quickly. Even a message sent in secrecy could be intercepted. There are those among the Norse jarls who would wade through blood to possess what we guard here. The wisdom in this caution was undeniable. Bjorn had witnessed firsthand how rumors of wealth could transform reasonable men into murderous opportunists. His 8 years abroad had shown him countless examples of greed's corrupting influence, from petty thievery among shield brothers to the calculated betrayals of kings. "Watch now," Sigrid instructed, interrupting his reflections. "This is the moment where ordinary stone reveals its hidden treasure." The mixture in the crucible had begun to separate, the dull grey slurry transforming as if by magic. A golden sheen appeared on its surface, spreading and strengthening until unmistakable beads of pure gold gathered, drawn together by forces Bjorn couldn't comprehend. "The Ancient Ones called this Earth's Tears," Sigrid said softly, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality she used when reciting traditional knowledge. Gold, hidden where no eye can detect it, released only through understanding the language. Of stone and fire, using specialized tongs, she transferred the golden beads to a waiting mold, where they would cool into a small ingot no larger than Bjorn's thumb, yet worth more than many warriors earned in a year of raiding. A single Day's work for one person, Bjorn observed, calculating the value against the effort invested. Multiply this by weeks, months, years. And you understand why your father insisted on such elaborate protections, Sigrid finished for him. This knowledge, used without restraint, could disrupt the balance of wealth throughout the Norse. Lands, too much gold entering circulation too quickly would change its value. Conflict would inevitably follow. The chamber beneath the storehouse wasn't the only place Bjorn received instruction. During council meetings, Sigrid guided his understanding of Ravnholm's governance, the balancing of competing interests, the maintenance of relationships with neighboring settlements, the long-term planning required for a community to thrive, rather than merely survive. Most surprising to Bjorn was how naturally leadership began to return to him. After initial wariness, the village elders increasingly sought his opinions, particularly on matters of defense and trade routes. His years abroad, which he had considered largely wasted, provided valuable perspective on markets and threats beyond Ravnholm's immediate horizons. Even Freya's hostile attitude gradually tempered, though she maintained a watchful distance. Bjorn often caught her observing his interactions with the council. Her green eyes narrowed in assessment rather than outright suspicion. Occasionally she would challenge his suggestions, not from spite, he came to realize, but from genuine concern for Ravnholm's well-being. Your proposed trade route through Hrafnkel's territory assumes peaceful intentions that history doesn't support, she argued during one particularly heated council session. My grandmother and I have maintained our current arrangement with the southern settlements precisely because it avoids potential conflict. Rather than dismissing her concerns, Bjorn found himself weighing them seriously. You're right that Hrafnkel's people have historically been aggressive regarding their boundaries, he acknowledged, but their new Jarl faces pressure from Eastern raiders. An alliance offering protection in exchange for passage would benefit both our settlements. Freya's surprise at his reasonable response was evident, though she quickly masked it. Perhaps, but such an arrangement would require careful negotiation. Which is why I propose we send an initial delegation in spring, Bjorn concluded, not to establish the route immediately, but to assess the possibility. Sigrid, who had remained silent during this exchange, nodded with quiet approval. Later, in private, she commented, "You're learning to listen before deciding. Your father would be pleased with your progress." Not all aspects of Bjorn's new life proceeded as smoothly. His warriors, accustomed to action and adventure, chafed at the constraints of winter and settlement life. Halvard maintained discipline among them, but Bjorn recognized the growing restlessness in their eyes during training sessions in the snow-covered practice yard. They need purpose beyond guard duty, Halvard advised during a private conversation in the bathhouse. Men who have tasted battle don't easily settle into peaceful routines. Bjorn nodded, having considered this problem already. Come spring, we'll organize expeditions. Not raids, but exploration and trade missions. There are eastern markets I visited that have never seen Norse goods directly, without middlemen taking their share. And in the meantime, Halvard pressed, steam rising around his scarred frame. In the meantime, they will train Ravnholm's younger men in the fighting techniques we learned abroad. The settlement's defense force is competent but limited in their experience. Our methods from the Eastern campaigns would serve them well. This initiative proved surprisingly successful. The village's young men eagerly embraced training with the seasoned warriors, and the veterans themselves found satisfaction in passing on their hard-won knowledge. What began as basic weapons drills evolved into complex tactical exercises conducted in the surrounding forests. With scenarios modeled after actual battles Bjorn's men had fought. Throughout these developments, Bjorn's relationship with Sigrid evolved in unexpected ways. Though their marriage remained unconsummated as agreed, a genuine partnership formed between them. Each evening they shared a private meal in her chambers, discussing the day's events and planning future initiatives. Bjorn found himself increasingly valuing her insights, while she seemed to appreciate his more direct approach to problems. "You remind me of your father," she remarked one night, several months into their arrangement. "Not in temperament, you're far more impulsive than Thorgrim ever was, but in your capacity to grow beyond your own limitations." Bjorn looked up from the map he'd been studying. "You knew him well, it seems, despite your brief marriage." "Brief. In official terms," Sigrid agreed, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her drinking horn. "But we corresponded for nearly a year before I came to Ravnholm. Your father was methodical in his assessment of who could be trusted with the knowledge he'd discovered. And yet you accepted his proposal of marriage rather than simply acting as an advisor," Bjorn observed. "Why bind yourself to a dying man?" For the first time since their acquaintance began, Sigrid appeared momentarily vulnerable, the mask of self-possession slipping to reveal something softer beneath. "Because sometimes, Bjorn Ironside, there are forms of wealth more valuable than gold or land. Your father offered me respect few women of my calling ever receive, and a purpose greater than merely preserving ancient wisdom. He offered partnership." The simple truth in her words struck deeper than Bjorn expected. His own reasons for returning to Ravnholm had been entirely self-interested, reclaiming what he viewed as rightfully his. Yet somewhere in these winter months of learning and leadership, his perspective had begun to shift. "And now," he asked quietly, "what do you seek from our arrangement?" Sigrid studied him for a long moment before responding. "The same thing your father wanted, to ensure this knowledge benefits Ravnholm rather than destroying it. To see if you've become the man he believed you could be, and have I?" The question emerged before Bjorn could reconsider its vulnerability. "You're on the path," Sigrid replied with unexpected gentleness. "Further along than I expected when you first returned. If you're enjoying this saga of transformation and hidden treasure, make sure you've subscribed to our channel. Every subscription helps us bring you more epic Viking tales and enables us to continue creating the stories you love." Now, back to Bjorn's growing realization, spring arrived with sudden warmth that transformed Ravnholm almost overnight. The fjord ice broke with thunderous cracks, snow retreated up the mountainsides, and the settlement burst into activity. Fishing boats launched daily, fields were prepared for planting, and trading vessels from neighboring settlements began arriving with increasing frequency. With the changing season came a critical development in Bjorn's instruction. One morning, as they completed another successful extraction in the underground chamber, Sigrid announced it was time for the next phase of his training. "You've mastered the basic process," she acknowledged, inspecting the small gold ingot they had produced. "Now you must learn what lies beyond the golden door." Bjorn's pulse quickened. Since his first glimpse of the mysterious portal during their wedding night, Sigrid had maintained that he wasn't yet ready to discover what lay beyond. Whatever secrets it contained represented the deepest aspect of the ancient knowledge. "The time is right," he confirmed, trying to mask his eagerness. "Not because of the season," Sigrid clarified, "but because of your progress. You've demonstrated the patience and judgment necessary for what comes next." She retrieved her cedar staff from where it leaned against the wall, the first time Bjorn had seen her bring it into the underground chamber. With deliberate movements, she approached the golden door set within the stone arch, its surface still gleaming as if newly forged despite its apparent age. "What you will see beyond this threshold was not meant for casual viewing," she warned. "The Ancient Ones protected their greatest secrets, not just with physical barriers, but with knowledge that can overwhelm an unprepared mind." Bjorn straightened, his shoulders meeting her gaze directly. "I'm prepared." "We shall see," Sigrid replied, neither confirming nor doubting his claim. She placed her staff against the center of the golden door and began to speak in the same unknown language she had used to unlock the outer chamber. Unlike that simpler barrier, however, this enchantment required more elaborate invocation. Words seemed to build upon themselves, creating patterns of sound that resonated strangely in the enclosed space. As she spoke, the golden surface began to respond. What had appeared solid metal now shifted like water, ripples spreading outward from the staff's contact point. Symbols appeared within the liquid-like surface, rising and falling in sequence with Sigrid's words. Finally, with a sound like a distant bell, the golden barrier simply vanished, not swinging open like a conventional door, but disappearing entirely to reveal the chamber beyond. Bjorn stepped forward cautiously, then stopped in amazement. Before him stretched a space far larger than should have been physically possible given Ravnholm's landscape. The chamber extended at least 100 paces in each direction, its ceiling lost in shadow, despite light emanating from crystal formations embedded in the walls. But it wasn't the impossible dimensions that stole Bjorn's breath. It was the contents. The room held what could only be described as a small city, perfectly preserved. Buildings of unknown design stood in concentric circles around a central structure that resembled a temple or great hall. The architecture was unlike anything in Norse experience, flowing lines and perfect curves rather than the straight angles and practical designs Bjorn was familiar with. Most astonishing was the material from which everything was constructed. The entire miniature city gleamed with the unmistakable luster of solid gold. "What is this place?" Bjorn whispered, his voice sounding strangely flat in the vast chamber. "A memory," Sigrid answered, stepping beside him. "A perfect replica of the Ancient One's final city, preserved in gold that will never tarnish or decay. Their legacy and their knowledge waiting for those worthy to receive it." Bjorn moved forward, drawn by the intricate details visible in every structure. Each building featured miniature doors that could open, tiny windows through which one could peer, roof tiles individually rendered with perfect precision. "How is this possible?" he asked, kneeling to examine a street no wider than his palm, complete with minute fountains and what appeared to be market stalls. "The Ancient Ones understood matter at its deepest level," Sigrid explained, following him into the chamber. "They could reshape substances according to their will, creating representations perfect in every detail. This was their greatest achievement and their final act before departing these lands." "Departing, not dying out or being conquered?" Sigrid gestured toward the central structure. "According to the knowledge they left behind, they chose to leave, moving beyond the world we know to realms we cannot comprehend. This replica and the methods for extracting gold were gifts left for those who might follow, if they proved worthy of such knowledge." As they approached the central building, Bjorn noticed something he had overlooked in his initial astonishment. Within the structure, visible through its open doorway, sat tiny figures. Not statues, but what appeared to be actual people frozen, in golden immobility, engaged in some sort of council or ceremony. "Are these—" He couldn't complete the question, its implications too disturbing. "Representations only," Sigrid assured him. "The Ancient Ones left images of themselves so we might understand their form and nature. They were not unlike us in appearance, though their understanding far surpassed our own. The figures, each taller than Bjorn's smallest finger, were gathered around a central table upon which rested an object he could not quite make out, something that seemed to emit light, even in its golden state. "This is what my father discovered," Bjorn said, comprehension dawning. "Not just the method for extracting gold, but this impossible place." "Yes," Sigrid confirmed, "and with it, instructions for using the knowledge responsibly." The ancient ones foresaw that such wealth could bring destruction if misused. They left warnings alongside their gifts. She directed his attention to inscriptions that lined the base of the central building, symbols similar to those on the golden door, but arranged in patterns Bjorn now recognized as instructional rather than merely protective. "These describe their fall," Sigrid translated, her finger tracing the alien script. "How their earlier civilizations destroyed themselves through greed and conflict over resources. How they eventually learned that prosperity without wisdom leads inevitably to ruin." Bjorn studied the inscriptions, recognizing the profound truth that they contained. Had he gained access to this chamber immediately upon his return to Ravnholm, would he have heeded such warnings, or would he have seen only the immeasurable wealth it represented? "This is why my father created such elaborate conditions for my inheritance," he said slowly. "He wanted to ensure I understood the responsibility that comes with such knowledge." Sigrid nodded, a look of approval warming her aged features. "Thorgrim feared that without proper preparation you might repeat the Ancient One's earlier mistakes. Muldi using this power for personal glory rather than community benefit." For perhaps the first time since his return, Bjorn felt genuine gratitude toward his father rather than resentment. The arrangement with Sigrid, which had initially seemed a humiliating obstacle, now revealed itself as a gift of incalculable value, not just in gold, but in wisdom. "There's more to show you," Sigrid said, moving deeper into the miniature city. "Each district contains different knowledge, methods for cultivation that increase yields threefold, techniques for strengthening iron beyond what our finest smiths can achieve, healing practices lost to modern understanding." They spent hours exploring the Golden City, with Sigrid translating inscriptions and explaining their significance. By the time they finally returned through the golden doorway, which rematerialized behind them with the same bell-like tone, Bjorn's mind was overwhelmed with possibilities. "We've barely scratched the surface of what they left behind," Sigrid told him as they secured the outer chamber. "In the year since your father and I first entered that space, we managed to translate only a fraction of their knowledge. It will take lifetimes to fully understand everything they preserved. Then we must ensure this knowledge passes to worthy successors," Bjorn responded, the implications of her statement clear. Neither Sigrid nor he would live long enough to complete this work. It would require generations of careful stewardship. In that moment, standing in the subterranean chamber with the elderly Volva who had become his unexpected mentor, Bjorn Ironside felt the final transformation of his purpose. What had begun as a simple desire to reclaim his birthright had evolved into something far more significant, a commitment to preserving and properly using knowledge that could transform Norse society itself. The warrior who had returned to Ravnholm seeking personal redemption now understood he had stumbled into a destiny far larger than himself. And for the first time since his father's death, he felt truly worthy of the inheritance Thorgrim had protected so carefully. As spring turned to summer, Ravnholm flourished under their shared leadership. The carefully controlled gold production funded improvements that benefited everyone: better fishing vessels, enhanced farming techniques, stronger trade relationships with neighboring settlements. Bjorn implemented a rotating training program that made every able-bodied villager part of the defense force, while Sigrid expanded her teaching beyond just Freya and Bjorn to include selected young people who showed particular aptitude and character. One warm evening, as they shared their customary meal and discussion in Sigrid's chambers, she surprised him with an unexpected announcement. "I've made my decision," she said, setting aside her drinking horn. "As of tomorrow's council meeting, I will formally declare you ready to assume full leadership of Ravnholm, as your father's will provides." Bjorn stared at her in genuine surprise. The year isn't complete. There are still 2 months remaining in our arrangement. The time specified was a minimum, not a requirement, Sigrid reminded him. You've demonstrated everything Thorgrim hoped to see. Wisdom in using wealth, patience in learning difficult concepts, and genuine concern for Ravnholm's people rather than personal glory. Her approval warmed him more than he would have expected months earlier. And what of you? Will you return to the northern valleys? My place is here now, she replied simply. Not as Ravnholm's leader or your wife in anything but name, but as guardian of the ancient knowledge. With your permission, I would continue instructing those with aptitude for understanding what lies beneath the golden door. You have more. And then my permission, Bjorn said with unexpected feeling. You have my gratitude and respect. Without your guidance, I would never have understood what my father truly left me. Sigrid's weathered face softened into a genuine smile. You've surprised me, Bjorn Ironside. When you first returned, I saw only the impulsive young man who had abandoned his father years before. Now I see a leader worthy of Thorgrim's legacy, and perhaps capable of surpassing it. The formal transfer of authority took place the following day, with the entire settlement gathering to witness. Sigrid presented Bjorn with his father's ceremonial arm rings, forged from the first gold they had extracted together from the ancient method. From this day forward, she proclaimed, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, Bjorn Ironside stands as rightful leader of Ravnholm, heir to Thorgrim Stormcaller's legacy in both blood and spirit. The celebration lasted well into the night, with even Freya finally offering Bjorn a grudging toast. You're not what I expected, she admitted, the mead loosening her usual reserve. I thought you'd take the gold and squander it on glory-seeking adventures. 6 months ago I might have, Bjorn acknowledged honestly. People can change when given reason to. As the festivities continued around them, Bjorn found himself standing at the edge of the gathering, looking out toward the fjord where his ship had first appeared nearly 7 months earlier. The desperate, destitute warrior who had returned seeking only to reclaim property now seemed like a stranger to him. Someone whose vision had been too narrow to recognize true wealth when it was offered. Halvard joined him, a horn of mead in his scarred hand. You've found your place, he observed, following Bjorn's gaze toward the water. After all our wandering, you finally found where you belong. We've found where we belong, Bjorn corrected, clapping his friend's shoulder. Ravnholm needs men who've seen the wider world, who understand both its dangers and opportunities. Halvard nodded, taking a long drink before responding. The men are content for now with the promise of trading expeditions. But will simple commerce satisfy you after years of battlefield glory? Bjorn turned to look back at the celebration, catching sight of Sigrid deep in conversation with a group of village elders. Even from a distance, her authority was evident in her posture and their attentive expressions. I've discovered a different kind of glory, he replied thoughtfully. Building something that lasts beyond a single lifetime. My father understood. This before I did. It just took an elderly widow and a golden city to make me see it too. The knowledge hidden beneath Ravnholm's soil would transform not just the settlement, but potentially all Norse society, if managed with the wisdom the ancient ones had emphasized. Not through sudden, disruptive wealth that would invite conflict, but through careful application that improved lives gradually and sustainably. This was Bjorn Ironside's true inheritance, not land or gold or title, but purpose worthy of a lifetime's dedication. The penniless warrior, who had married a 70-year-old widow for her property, had discovered something far more valuable than mere wealth. He had found his place in a legacy stretching back to civilizations long vanished and forward to generations, yet unborn. As the celebration continued under the midnight sun, Bjorn raised his drinking horn in silent toast to his father's memory. Thorgrim had crafted his unusual will not from spite or distrust, but from profound love, the desire to give his son something more valuable than gold. wisdom, purpose, and a chance at greatness beyond battlefield glory. The ancient golden city waiting beneath their feet was just the beginning. Its knowledge, carefully shared with those who proved worthy, would ensure Ravnholm's prosperity for generations to come. And Bjorn, once desperate for mere survival, now stood as guardian of a treasure beyond price. Not the gold itself, but the wisdom to use it well. If you've enjoyed this epic Viking tale of hidden treasures and unexpected wisdom, please make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you these sagas of the North. Leave a comment below telling us what aspect of Viking history you'd like us to explore next. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Until our next journey together, may the gods watch over your path.